Octopus 2, often presented as Octopus 2 River of Fear, is a 2001 cop movie disguised as a giant monster movie. Quite why they've decided to hide the giant monster part of this movie beneath a cop script is lost to me. I have to assume that no one involved in this film wanted it to be a giant monster movie in the first place, but I'll get to why later. This movie was directed by Yossi Wayne, who, being honest, is more of a cinematographer than a director. On the cine front, he has quite a few notable credits, including work on The American Ninja 4 and Cyborg Cop 2. His directing work, well, let's say that's less illustrious, with the likes of Operation Delta Force 2 and US SEALs being considered some of his highlights. In short, he's a veteran of the schlock circuit, and here he's been assigned a role that's pretty much his second strongest element. So depending on how you look at it, we're either seeing him at his second best, or we're seeing him in a role that isn't necessarily his first best. This film has 3 writing credits to it, and I think it's fair to say they've drawn from an interesting pool. Bose Davidson is probably the best suited for writing a giant monster movie, as he's written a slew of post-50s giant creature features, including Spiders, Crocodile, and the original Octopus. He's also credited for writing The Last American Virgin. In short, if you were looking for a guy to write your giant monster movie, Bose seems like the right guy to involve. Quite how involved he was in the writing of the script, however, is somewhat debatable, based on how the end feature turned out. The other 2 writers involved in this movie were Danny Lerner, whose best known credits seem to be the bulk of the Operation Delta Force movies, and Michael D. Weiss, who's probably the best known of the 3, who supplied the screenplay here. He's probably best known for such garbage as Hostel 3 and The Scorpion King 4? I didn't even know there was a Scorpion King 2! Right, they're all going on my watch list. Anyway, both Bose and Danny are really more producers than they are writers. And as Weiss only provided the screenplay, this means that we're left with a film that was directed by somebody who isn't primarily a director, and written by 2 people who aren't primarily writers. Based on a screenplay by somebody who gave us The Scorpion King 4. Realistically, this film shouldn't have so much fallen out of the gate, more rocket-propelled itself into the ground. Though in some ways it's actually surpassed my expectations. Not in a lot of ways, but at least there's some good to be had here. The film stars Michael Riley Burke as Nick, one half of Nick and Walter, our buddy cops for this picture. Nick and Walter are both members of the police scuba team and are responsible for searching the murky depths of New York's rivers in order to solve crimes. When an attempted drugs bust turns out to be a false alarm, both Nick and Walter are placed on their very last warning. I'm getting flashbacks to tunnel vision. Anyway, little does the chief know, Walter has asked for a transfer, and he's going to be leaving the department for a cushy office position soon. But shortly before the transfer takes place, 2 dead bodies are found in a nearby dockland. And with little to no evidence of a murderer or motive to hand, the pair are stumped. That is until, while investigating leads, they stumble on an old homeless man who tells them that the murderer is a giant octopus. While initially ridiculed, eventually Nick starts to believe him, and shortly thereafter the pair get attacked by that very octopus, who captures Walter, who's never seen again for the rest of the movie. This leaves Nick in a position where no one will believe him about the giant octopus killing boatmen in the Hudson River. And it's at this point that we're properly introduced to the mayor's assistant, and I believe one of the very, very few females in this film. Meredith Morton's Rachel, who's in charge of organising a 4th of July celebration down at the Docklands. Rachel doesn't believe Nick either, but slowly the pair grow close, and eventually they both decide to go and see if they can hunt down and get proof that the octopus is out there before it gets a chance to kill again. So, if I were to tell you that this film would fit in right at home with any of the public domain films usually available on the Mill Creek compilation sets, I think I'd give you a pretty good idea of exactly what the tone and feeling of this film is. I feel like calling it Octopus 2 is a bit of a cheat really, because while the octopus is important to the plot and does turn up in the film at least more than a couple of times, the majority of this film is more to do with first Nick and Walter trying to solve the murders, and then Nick and Rachel trying to find Squiddly Diddly. And I'm not entirely sure why they chose to hide or cover up the octopus for the majority of the film. I mean, the film's called Octopus 2. I'm pretty sure anybody coming to see this movie isn't going to be all that shocked that there's actually a giant octopus in this film. Though what will shock audiences is the distinct lack of a giant octopus in a film called Octopus 2. There are 2 octopi in this movie, a puppet version, represented both as a series of tentacles and the top half of a body, that actually doesn't look too bad. I mean, it's still obviously a puppet, but hey, they tried their best. And I've seen distinctly worse puppets in my time. For the biggest scenes, the octopus is often represented by CGI. This CG octopus is often only shown in shadows, but it does get the occasional moment out in full view. And it looks awful. Even for 2001, I'd have been thoroughly unimpressed by the CG for the giant octopus in this movie. So by 2018 standards, it's pretty dire. I have to somewhat admire their scope of trying to realise their vision, but I'm sure with some creative cinematography, they could have just stuck with the puppet and it would have been a lot better. The cinematography is fairly standard for a film like this. They don't really take very many creative risks here. It's all by the numbers. At least, the land sequences are. The movie has its style and knows how it wants to look, but it could have aspired to more. It's of quality, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is quality. Most of the shots are your basic formula: establishing shot, closer establishing shot, mid shot, close up, 2-shot. That's about as complex as they get here. And weirdly, there's a dream sequence that seems to have been entirely shot on a green screen because it works in perspectives that simply couldn't be captured in real life. It also uses that god-awful CG octopus. I mean, I guess that could be seen as their creative flair, but to me it actually went too far the other way and just looks really silly, poorly made, and crammed into what is probably the most straight-laced giant monster movie I've ever seen. What I will give this film credit for, however, is the underwater scenes, which feel almost like you're watching a completely different movie. Everything's quite nicely shot in these underwater segments. They use a reasonably good variety of shots, and the look and feeling of these scenes really stuck out to me in a sea of mediocrity. No pun intended. My only complaint about these shots is that I don't think the Hudson River has ever looked as clean or blue as it does here. Whether that was a continuity thing, or whether they just couldn't get the colour graded to give an authentic murky brown, is anyone's guess. But it is worth noting. Acting-wise, for the most part the cast aren't terrible. They're far from brilliant, but they handle the script reasonably well enough, and with one major exception, which I'll get to in a bit, the cast are pretty much fine. At their best, they're good. At their worst, I'd say they just about creep into overly cheesy territory, and not in a good way. The direction, on the other hand, is actually pretty reasonable. While the performances may not be brilliant, the cast seem fairly animate, and Yossi seems to know what he wants to show and how he wants to show it. Again, this isn't groundbreaking stuff. Not being terribly directed isn't an accolade, but he seems to hold the rudder steadily enough, even if it does feel a bit generic in places. And I suppose considering that he's more of a cinematographer than a director, I do have to give him credit that he's handled this one for the most part pretty well. What does give this film quite a big boost is the editing, which here is handled by Calle, who has a real history with cutting films like this. Though Octopus 2 would be one of her first creature feature cuts, she does a remarkably good job of making this film work as well as it can. Any fight scenes involving the octopus are concentrated and focus on quick cuts to give a sense of tension. Scenes that less talented editors would probably leave emotionless or even laughably bad. By contrast, under Calle, these scenes are given a much more bigger oomph by using proper timing and making sure that everything stays on screen for just the right amount of time. It's the skills used here that really save this film from just being an out-and-out stinker. Though the editing can't save everything, and you can't make a purse out of a sow's ear. The biggest problem I have with this movie is its script. The first act's pretty much fine. They set up all the character elements and just let them work towards developing their own arcs. That's all good. Where this film derails is somewhere in the second act, around the time when the octopus takes Walter. From that point on, this film just begins to inflate with padding, and it just gets more and more bloated till I was literally on the verge of turning it off as the third act was warming up. It's just scene after scene of moody Nick walking from place to place, not getting very much farther, and having an odd emotional crisis. And while I'd be praising this writing had it been any other movie, the film's literally called Octopus 2, and I spent most of the second and third act going, "Come on, bring out the giant octopus and make it do stuff." At around 2/3 into this, I'd felt like I'd been lied to. And only making matters worse, the film effectively ends about 20 minutes before the end credits run. And the final 20 minutes of this film are dedicated almost entirely to a B-plot. A B-plot that's introduced to us so haphazardly that it's up there as one of the worst sequences I've ever seen in a movie. The whole plot takes place in a tunnel, with one of the worst actresses I've ever seen, made up to look about 40 years older than she is, doing her worst attempt at fake driving in a car that clearly isn't moving, intercut with stock footage that doesn't match up. And she easily gives one of the most irritating performances I've ever seen. It's seriously worth digging this film out just for her 1 or 2 scenes at the end of this film, because you won't believe that someone could perform this badly. Octopus 2 was produced by New Image Productions in 2001, and it was distributed by Hollywood DVD in the UK. And I'm finding quite quickly that if your movie can be distributed by Hollywood DVD, it probably shouldn't. Surprisingly, the print quality on this DVD was quite good. There was little in the way of fading or wear, and it looks pretty solid on this release. There are no extra features on this set. Hollywood DVD releases very rarely do have anything. They're the kind of company that offer interactive menus as special features. As of the time of recording, there are no plans to release this on Blu-ray, and I can't believe I just read that out with a straight face. Ultimately, this movie commits the cardinal sin, thou shalt not bore. And some nice underwater shots, reasonably tight editing, and iffy at best Sinian direction really can't save this snorefest of a plotline. What I find most unbelievable about this whole thing is that the film is supposed to feature a giant octopus destroying New York, and they've somehow managed to make that boring. And I'm really lost for words as to how that's even possible. Only adding to the woe an uninspiring soundtrack and a terrifically out-of-place end credits score that I feel only exacerbated my feelings on this picture. Boring. This movie's terribly boring. I'd like to see if the original was any better, but all I can say on this is check out the old lady tunnel sequence if you want to laugh, and go and watch Zombie Flesh Eaters if you're in the mindset to see some good underwater cinematography in a movie that's actually generally good throughout. Otherwise, give this one a miss.